So, what was the first computer that humans had at their disposal at the dawn of human existence? I'll give you a hint. An early version of this computer came into existence around 5 million years ago. It is the most sophisticated, complex, and most powerful computer that has ever existed in this world. And it is located right up here between our own two ears. Yup, it's the human brain. But despite how wonderful and powerful this brain computer is, it's not all that great at keeping track of numbers, which is why mankind has always relied on computers or devices so as to keep track of this sort of information. Because of this, computers have played a vital role in the lives of humans for as long as there have been humans on this earth. For the most part, all of these computers have aided humans in the act of counting, whether it be on abacuses or collections of pebbles in a bag, or sticks wrapped up into a bundle, or even the fingers on our hands. All of these can be considered as computers since they assist the human brain in processing information. Okay, let's back up a bit and define what I mean by a computer. A computer, as defined by Wikipedia, is a machine that can be programmed to carry out sequences of arithmetic or logical operations automatically. Well, although that is a good description of what a modern day computer is, I find it a little restrictive since it focuses solely on calculating machines, performing those arithmetic and logical operations. There's a subtle implication that those machines are electronic in nature. But what about an abacus? It's a machine that can perform mathematical operations, but it's not electronic and it can't be programmed. But what about a weaving loom? It's a machine and it can be programmed to weave out different designs and patterns automatically. But it too is not electronic, nor can it perform mathematical operations. Can one think of these devices as computers? What about the human brain itself? Well, if we're willing to call the human brain a machine and just ignore the thing about being electronic, then it ticks off all the boxes in that Wikipedia definition. But to me, I feel that the definition given by Wikipedia, with all due respects to Wikipedia, is a bit restrictive and excludes devices that probably should be considered in the realm of computers. Here's what my personal thoughts are on what a definition of a computer should be. A computer is the device that receives signals or input from the outside world that it then translates, i.e. processes those signals into output that is sent back out to that outside world. Now, by the outside world, I mean the realm outside of the computer. That could be the real world in which we live. It could be the world of the internet. It could be a database. Or it could be the world inside a computer circuit board, or even inside a computer chip. Between its various components, the intention here is that this definition is to make it broad enough so as to include as many devices as possible. Now, one can argue against this definition in that the feature of programmability is missing. But I would argue that programmability is included in this definition due to the fact that a program doesn't simply appear out of nowhere, but must first be inputted into the computer. Can you see where I'm going with this? In other words, a program is inputted to the computer where it is then processed by the computer and then outputted as a sequence of arithmetic and logical operations. Boom! We just came back to the Wikipedia definition of a computer. But what we've managed to do here is to describe a computer within a computer. But back to the topic at hand about ancient computers. Now that we have a broader definition as to what a computer is, early hominids probably relied on counting on their fingers as they scavenged the landscape for food and resources. A hunter-gatherer who had 2 children to look after would probably have known that he had to gather as many items of fruit as he had fingers on his hand. If he was in a tribe and was providing for other hominids in his tribe, then he might resort to using fingers on both hands and possibly even his thumbs as well. All in all, using fingers to count was probably the first and most primitive use of a computer by ancient humans. And despite how primitive this computer was, its usage was a far cry superior to anything that any other animals in the wild were using. It could be argued that the usage of such primitive, simplistic computers was one of those things that powered the evolution of the human brain to the levels of intelligence that we enjoy today. But enough of all this conjecture. Back to those ancient computers. As time progressed, and as societies became more sophisticated, such as the development of speech and writing, the organization of tribes, the development of agriculture, and eventually the domestication of animals, the need for more powerful computers would have pushed humans to design devices of ever-increasing sophistication. And probably the first major advancement of this was, of course, the abacus. The initial design of the abacus was probably born out of the simple usage of a bag of pebbles as a means of organizing those pebbles to represent numbers in a more meaningful fashion. But this design of organization led to a huge advancement in that it allowed humans to not only count well up into the millions, but it also allowed humans to perform mathematical operations such as addition and subtraction on those large numbers, and with incredible speed, I might add. This caused humans to start to think in abstract terms, in terms of numbers and in the relationship between those numbers. Think about it. It took those early hominids literally millions of years to go from I've got coconuts to I've got 4 coconuts. Can you see the difference? The early hominid brain supposedly didn't have the capacity to understand the abstract concept of a number. But the evolutionary pressures of survival in the wild are what probably pushed the hominid brain to evolve into the Homo sapiens brain. Amongst other things, it evolved from using fingers to represent things into numbers to represent things. And once the abstract concept of numbers came into the human psyche, we moved away from using our fingers to count to using bags of pebbles, and then to using the abacus. Now, the abacus was a marvelous invention because although a human could calculate these basic mathematical operations by hand, it took a lot longer to arrive at a result than by using an abacus. Plus, manual calculations were far more prone to error than what a seasoned abacus operator could accomplish. Those errors were yet another shortfalling of those human brain computers. But it also started us humans down the road of relying on devices to assist our brains in processing information. That road of reliance turns out to be a double-edged sword. These devices allowed us to think in a far more abstract manner since we don't need to be bogged down with the mundane task of performing rudimentary mathematical operations. But at the same time, it also allowed us to dismiss and ignore those same operations, to the point where many people would lose sight of those operations and lose the ability to perform them when those computing devices were not available. In other words, we became overly reliant on those devices to the point where we became dependent on them and would become lost and isolated when access to those devices was suddenly cut off. But let's get back to those devices evolved over time by looking at some other ancient computers and how their complexity and sophistication increased with time, keeping in mind how the increase in sophistication of these devices has made us become more and more dependent on them over time. The sundial is a curious computational device. Its input is rays from the sun. Its processing is to eliminate certain rays so as to form a shadow on a surface, and the output is where the edge of that shadow would land on graticules engraved into the surface. We're all familiar with the classic sundial design and how to read what the time of day is from it. But with a bit of ingenuity, a sundial can also be designed so as to allow us to tell what week of the year it is. Here's an oriental sundial that does just that. Look at the grid on the lines inside the bowl of the base. You can tell what the time of day is by seeing where the edge of the shadow lands on the vertical lines in the grid, but you can also tell what week of the year it is by where the tip of the shadow lands on the horizontal lines in the grid. In other words, throughout the year, the length of the shadow will grow longer or shorter up and down the grid, hence indicating what the week of the year is. Pure genius. But eventually, humans started to build ships and took to the high seas in them. Navigation became a big issue, especially when one was far out to sea away from land. Instruments, more computers, were needed, and what followed were 4 critical devices required for successful navigation, namely the compass, the telescope, the clock, and lastly the sextant. In addition, a good set of maps, navigational charts, and tables were also needed. With these devices, a trained navigator could pinpoint a ship's location virtually anywhere in the world within a few nautical miles. The compass would tell them in which direction was north. Not only could they then determine what the ship's heading was, but they could also determine what their meridian was. What is a meridian, I hear you ask? Well, a meridian is an imaginary line that runs across the globe from north to south pole, and which passes directly through the point on Earth where you're currently standing, or floating if you're in a ship out at sea. Here's the Earth with its longitude and latitude lines drawn on it. The longitude lines are all meridian lines themselves because they all go from the North Pole to the South Pole. But let's say that you're standing somewhere on the western coast of North America. Then this would be your meridian. Your meridian line is very specific to where you are standing around the globe. Knowing your meridian is important because the angle between where the sun is in the sky and your meridian line tells you what the local time of day is. You can't use a sundial while out at sea for that because a sundial needs to be fixed to the ground so that it doesn't move around. But when you're out at sea, the ship is constantly moving all over the place, which rules out using a sundial. The telescope was also an essential instrument for navigation because it was used to sight points of land off in the distance. By identifying points of land, you could determine where you were on a map. It also allowed you to see and identify other ships that are close to you. This was important in the event that the other ship was unfriendly and posed a threat to you and your cargo. Having a clock is an easy way of telling the time of day, but but even a good clock can drift a bit, and after a few days it can drift significantly. Plus, while you're sailing around the globe, the local time of day will be shifting constantly as you travel from longitude to longitude. One way of being able to reset your clock and get it onto the local time of day is to watch for when the sun crosses over the meridian. When it crosses the meridian, you can reset your clock to high noon. This will keep a good clock fairly close to the time of day and all night long. And finally, it wasn't until the early 1700s that the sextant was first designed. The sextant is a very sophisticated and accurate device that combines the technologies of a compass, a telescope, and a clock so as to measure the angles between two objects, such as the sun and the horizon. The angle between the sun and the horizon, along with the local time of day, will give you your latitude on the globe. With accurate star charts and by recording the time when major stars cross in the sky over the meridian at night, you can tell what your longitude is. In addition, if you're within sight of land and you can identify 3 or more points on land, then you can measure the angles between those points with the sextant, from which you can determine your exact position in the water on a chart. Now, one anomalous device that was discovered and determined to have been constructed circa 100 BC is a device called the Antikythera mechanism. It has been described as an orrery, a device that simulates the motion of the planets and moons in the solar system. With such a device, one can predict the position of the planets and the moons into the future, a useful instrument when planning a voyage out at sea that requires navigation at night. That the Antikythera device was probably intended to be used in place of charts for navigation at sea. However, it's arguable as to the utility of this device, as there has only ever been one such device discovered. If the instrument was superior to other methods of navigation, then all ships would have had one. More of these devices would have been showing up in shipwrecks, and there would have been documentation on their existence and how to use them. User guides, in other words. But none such evidence exists, which probably means that this particular device didn't work all that well. But it was a highly sophisticated device that was way beyond the state-of-the-art of device design and construction for the era of 100 BC. Now, one might accuse me at this point of being rather cavalier with my definition of what composes a computer, and I admit that I've probably been speaking rather fast and loose with that term. But it can't be dismissed that the development of these ancient devices helped set the trajectory of human development for devices that more classically resemble the calculation machines that we think of when we hear the word computer. As one can see, there have been several computing devices developed over the millennia, and there have been an ever increase in their sophistication and complexity. The examples that I have highlighted here are just a small sampling of the many devices that have been developed over time. But even with this small sampling, one can see how humanity has continued to strive to develop computing devices to augment what it is that our brains can accomplish. So, at this juncture, we're going to shift our attention away from ancient computers and move on to historical computers, devices that have been developed within the last few hundred years. And there's no better place to start that discussion than with the slide rule. Please join me in the next video on historic computers. See you then.